everyone who has ever watched. The Fellowship of the Ring remembers what happens when Frodo offers the ring to Galadriel in the garden at Caras. Galathon. They remember the light shifting, the voice dropping, the face flickering between something radiant and something terrible. They remember the moment passing. They remember her saying she will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel. What they do not remember, because the film never told them, is that Galadriel had already been thinking about this for centuries. Not that moment, not that offer. The ring itself, what it would mean, what she would do, what she would become. Tolkien writes in Unfinished Tales that she was tempted for a long time, not by Frodo's specific offer, which was merely the moment of decision, but by the possibility that had always lived at the edge of her long life. The possibility that she might one day hold the one ring in her hands and have to choose. She had thought about it. She had done the work. She had looked at herself, long and clearly across the centuries, and she had seen what she would become, and she had said no. But here is the question this video is really about. The question underneath everything. Did Sauron fear Galadriel because she might have defeated him? Or because she was the only being in Middle-earth who could have become him? Think about what that would mean. Not a weapon turned against him, a mirror. The same power, the same hunger for order and preservation and dominion, the same capacity to reshape the world according to a single will. A Sauron who wanted beauty instead of ruin. Which, from where the free peoples stood, might not have been a difference worth celebrating. This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what Tolkien himself wrote. In Letter 247, when he described exactly what Galadriel would have become had she taken the ring. This is what the text says. When you follow it all the way down, follow it with me. To understand why Sauron feared her, you have to first understand who she actually was, not the serene queen of the movies, not the ethereal lightbringer who hands Frodo a phial and sends him off with a blessing. That version of Galadriel is real, but it is a version that was chosen. It was not the only one available to her. Galadriel was Finarfin's daughter, granddaughter of Finwë, High King of the Noldor. She was born in Valinor, in the light of the two trees in an age before the world had shadows deep enough to hide in. The Silmarillion tells us she was the greatest of the Noldor, except Fëanor himself. And that distinction matters, because Fëanor was the most gifted, most passionate, most catastrophically reckless craftsman who had ever lived, a mind so bright it eventually burned itself out and took half the world with it. Galadriel was his equal in everything except that capacity for ruinous excess. She was not lesser, she was more controlled, and from the beginning she had ambitions of her own. The history of Galadriel and Celeborn, compiled in Unfinished Tales, makes this explicit. Tolkien writes that Galadriel had a desire to go to Middle-earth that was not merely restless wandering. She wanted a realm, she wanted dominion, not in Sauron's sense of dominion as control, but in the older, more honest sense. She wanted a place where she was the architect, where her will shaped the landscape, where her vision of what elvish civilization could be would find its fullest expression. She wanted to rule. This is not a character flaw in Tolkien's world. It is simply what she was. The great and powerful in Middle-earth are defined by the scale of their desires, and Galadriel's desires were always vast. But here is what the movies stripped from her entirely. She left Valinor under the shadow of the doom of Mandos, the Noldor's exile from the Blessed Realm, the consequence of Fëanor's rebellion, the kinslaying at Alqualondë, the theft of the ships, applied to Galadriel too. She had not participated in the kinslaying. She had not sworn the oath of Fëanor, but she had still chosen to follow. She had still departed. And when the ban was pronounced, when Mandos himself declared that the Noldor were forbidden from returning until the world was changed, she was bound by it. Picture this, a young woman, young by elvish reckoning but centuries old by any human scale, standing on the shore of Middle-earth as the ships depart back across the sea. The blessed realm is behind her. The whole shape of her future is ahead. And in that moment, she has traded the only home she has ever known for a continent she intends to master, because she was always going to choose the harder, greater thing. She was not exiled. She chose to stay. The Silmarillion makes this distinction. She refused the pardon of the Valar not once but repeatedly across the long ages, because returning would have meant abandoning what she was building, and she was not ready to abandon it. Hold that. A being of enormous power with legitimate grievances and genuine gifts, who spent thousands of years working towards something she believed in, so deeply she chose exile over return. Now add one ring of immeasurable power to that equation. Here is something most people do not think about when they watch that scene in the garden. When Frodo offers the ring to Galadriel, he is not offering it to a naive figure encountering Ringcraft for the first time. He is offering it to someone who has spent the entire Third Age, 3,000 years, actively wielding a ring of power. Nenya, the ring of adamant, water, the White Ring. The Lord of the Rings tells us she bears it. In Fellowship, when Sam sees all three rings of the elves in a moment of clarity, he sees hers on her finger. But Unfinished Tales goes further. It reveals that Galadriel received Nenya from Celebrimbor, the last of the great elvish smiths, and that she used it throughout the Third Age to preserve Lothlorien. The Malorn trees, the timeless air, the sense when you enter Caras Galadon that the world outside has paused, and you are standing in something older and truer. All of that is Ringcraft. All of that is Galadriel's active wielding of a ring of power, deployed every day for millennia. Now think about what that means for the moment Frodo places the One Ring before her. She did not encounter the One Ring as a stranger to its kind. She knew what rings of power felt like from the inside. She knew the sensation of will amplified, of vision extended, of desire given a mechanism to act on the world. She had been living inside that sensation for 3,000 years. She understood Ringcraft not as an observer but as a practitioner. And Tolkien's letter 144 makes the stakes explicit. The One Ring was Sauron's masterwork, precisely because it was designed to bind all the other rings to itself. If Sauron had ever reclaimed the One, the powers of the three, Narya, Vilya, and Nenya, would have been revealed, and the wearers would have been subject to his dominion. Which means there is a logical corollary the letter implies without stating outright. If the One Ring had been transferred not to Sauron but to one of the three wearers, the combinatorial result would have been something qualitatively different from anything Sauron had planned for. A wielder of the One Ring who also understood the three from the inside, who had built her Ringcraft over an age and had the will to use it, who had desires that were vast and ordered and civilized, and therefore capable of being translated into empire in ways that simple hunger for destruction never could be. This is where it gets strange. Sauron wanted to control Middle-earth because he believed that order imposed from above was the only way to prevent the chaos that always lay beneath. That is, in Tolkien's theological framing, the corruption of a genuine insight. Sauron began as a being who genuinely loved order. Morgoth twisted that love into the desire to be the source of all order, which meant the desire to eliminate all will except his own. Galadriel also loved order. She also loved a particular vision of civilization, beautiful, enduring, free from corruption. But she had not followed Morgoth's path. She had watched it from the outside and understood it and rejected it. Except that the ring did not care about intentions. Tolkien's cosmological rules are clear on this. The ring worked by amplifying desire and bending it toward domination. Not because domination was what you wanted in the simple sense, but because the mechanism of the ring was Sauron's mechanism. It could only express his will, and his will was always toward control. Take the ring with the desire to preserve beauty, and you will preserve beauty by controlling everything that might threaten it. Take it with the desire to protect your people, and you will protect your people by subjugating everyone else. The purity of the original desire is irrelevant. The ring translates everything into the same grammar, domination, and Galadriel already knew this. That is why the temptation was not the offer. The temptation had been there the whole time. In every moment of the Third Age, when she had extended Nenya's power and felt what it meant to hold back entropy, hold back time, hold back the creeping darkness, in every one of those moments there was a version of that desire that pointed further, that said, what if you didn't just hold back the darkness in this valley, but everywhere? What if the power were sufficient? What if a ring existed that could let you do it fully, completely, without compromise? She had been living next door to that question for 3,000 years. Here is what nobody asks when they think about Galadriel and Sauron. She recognized him. Not in the Third Age, when he was building toward open war. Not after Numenor fell and the shadow was plain to see. She recognized him during his most successful deception, during the years he spent in Eregion under the guise of Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, teaching the elvish smiths the craft of ring-making. And she recognized him while almost everyone else in Middle-earth did not. The Silmarillion tells us, in Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, that Galadriel counseled against receiving Anatar from the very beginning. When the emissary arrived in Eregion with his gifts and his knowledge and his flattery, Celebrimbor and most of the other elves were persuaded. Galadriel was not. She said no. She warned against him. She was overruled. Think about what this means. Sauron's guise as Anatar was arguably the most successful deception in the history of the Third Age. He was so convincing that he managed to teach the finest craftsmen in Middle-earth to make the very instruments of their own enslavement, and they did not realize what he was until the One Ring was forged, and they felt it through their own. That is how good the disguise was. Galadriel saw through it. She did not have proof. She could not name him. But she had spent the First Age in a world where Morgoth was real and present, and his servants were everywhere. And she had developed, over that long tutelage, a capacity for recognizing the specific quality of a will that wanted to own other wills. She felt it in Anatar. She recognized the particular shape of the desire beneath the gifts, and she said so, and nobody listened. Sauron did not forget this. He could not afford to, because a being who had recognized him through his best disguise was a being whose perception was, in some ways, commensurate with his own. He could deceive Gil-galad and Círdan. He could not deceive Galadriel, and the fact that she had named him privately, accurately, while he was still successfully deceiving everyone else. That was a form of power over him that existed independently of armies, independently of rings, independently of any external force. She saw him clearly, and clear sight in Tolkien's world is always dangerous. Picture this. Not a battle. Not a confrontation. A council chamber in Eregion, somewhere in the middle years of the Second Age, long before the War of the Last Alliance. An emissary who is not what he claims to be, speaking persuasively about the gifts of craft and knowledge, surrounded by elves who are listening with bright, hungry attention. And one figure at the edge of the council, watching. Not persuaded, not visibly hostile, just watching. Her eyes resting on the emissary with the particular quality of attention that does not look away, that does not blink, that simply observes until the thing being observed becomes impossible to mistake. He knew she saw him. He knew she had told Celebrimbor what she suspected. He knew she had been overruled. And he knew that if she ever had the means to act on that recognition, she would. That combination, her perception, her power, her will, her refusal to be deceived, was what made her dangerous in a way that no other figure in Middle-earth could replicate. Gil-galad was powerful but did not have her ringcraft. Celebrimbor understood ringcraft but was deceived. Círdan held Narya and recognized Sauron's nature eventually, but he passed the ring to Gandalf rather than wielding it himself. Galadriel alone combined all of it. The perception to see through him, the power to challenge him, the Ringcraft to understand what she was dealing with, and the will to resist the temptation of using the greater power to stop him. That last part is not a weakness. That last part is what makes her singular. Here is where we leave the films entirely and follow the text into places they never went. In Tolkien's letters, specifically letter 247, he answers a question about what the bearers of the elvish rings would have become had they used the One Ring. He does not hedge. He does not demur. He says directly what Galadriel would have become, and the answer is not a wise queen who defeated Sauron and restored peace. The answer is something far more unsettling. Tolkien writes that Galadriel would have become a powerful, terrible, and beautiful queen, a sorceress. He describes a figure of dreadful power whose dominion would have expressed itself through beauty and order, but would still have been dominion. He compares the result not to a restored golden age, but to something that would have matched Sauron. Not replaced him with good, but replaced him with a different will imposing itself on the same broken world. Read that again. Tolkien himself, not a fan theory, not an interpretation. The author, in plain language, describing what his most powerful elvish character would have become if she had taken the step she was always capable of taking. She would have been terrible. And here is the thing nobody talks about. Tolkien does not say she would have been wrong. He does not say the world would have been worse. He does not even say she would have been evil, in the clear sense that Sauron was evil. What he says is that she would have wielded power of a kind that the free peoples of Middle-earth could not have lived under, even if they would have been fed and sheltered and surrounded by beauty while they lived under it. The great and terrible queen, the sorceress, the one who would have matched Sauron. That figure might have genuinely loved her subjects. That is exactly the problem. Love that expresses itself as total control is still total control. And Galadriel knew this. She understood the logic. She had watched it across the first age, and the second age, and the third age, and she had seen how every being who reached for that kind of power, Morgoth, Sauron, Saruman in his small way, had followed the same arc. Genuine desire for good, gradually replaced by desire for the mechanism that produced good. Gradually replaced by desire for the mechanism itself, regardless of what it produced. She did not want to follow that arc. She had, in fact, spent the entire Third Age making sure she did not, wielding Nenya with one hand and holding herself back with the other, extending only as much power as preservation required and no more. And then a hobbit showed up in her garden with the One Ring in his pocket, and she had to decide. Picture this. Not the cinematic version, not the crackling dark queen of the adaptation. Something quieter and therefore more frightening. An immortal woman who has spent 3,000 years holding herself at the edge of a cliff, who has developed, through will and discipline and long deliberation, a very specific grip on the part of herself that wants to step off. She has been holding that grip for ages. It has become familiar. It has become in a strange way comfortable. The cliff has always been there. She has always been standing at its edge. The only thing that has changed is that now, for the first time, the step off the cliff is actually possible. She feels the ring. She understands it from the inside, because she understands Ringcraft from the inside. She knows exactly what it would do to her, and exactly what she would do with it. And the terrifying thing is not that the vision is dark. The terrifying thing is that the vision is beautiful. Beautiful and wrong, and she knows it, and she says no. Let's return to that phrase, tempted for a long time. It appears in the mirror of Galadriel in the Fellowship of the Ring. After Frodo offers her the ring and she refuses, she says, "I pass the test, I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." But just before that, in describing why the test is so dangerous for her specifically, she says, "Through ages of the world I have tested my will, and now I have won." Ages, not the moment, ages. The deliberation that led to her refusal was not begun when Frodo walked into her garden. It was begun, perhaps, when Anatar arrived in Eregion, and she felt the particular quality of his will and understood, for the first time with real clarity, what a ring built to dominate all rings would mean in the hands of someone with desires like hers. It was continued across every year she wore Nenya, and felt its power moving through her, and chose every time to limit herself to what was necessary for preservation. It was refined through the long cataloguing of exactly what she was tempted by and exactly how far she could go before the mechanism of Ringcraft would take over from her own will and carry her the rest of the way without her consent. She had been running a centuries-long experiment on herself, and the result of the experiment was a very precise understanding of exactly where her limits were. Here is what that means. When Sauron calculated threats, he was calculating beings whose relationship to power he could model. He understood elves because he understood the elvish love of craft and beauty, and the elvish vulnerability to the desire to preserve things forever. He understood men because he understood the Mannar hunger for glory and legacy and the mannish terror of death. He had used these understandings to great effect across both the second and third ages, bending wills, corrupting ambitions, making offers that were always perfectly calibrated to the specific desire of the specific being he was targeting. He could not calculate Galadriel, not because she was beyond his understanding. He understood her type of desire, had probably always understood it, but because she had spent ages developing a system of self-knowledge that was, in essence, a defense against exactly the kind of calculation he was making. He knew what she wanted. She knew what she wanted, too. She had mapped her own desire with more precision than he had, and she had built, stone by stone, a resistance to it that was not about suppressing the desire, but about understanding it so clearly that the desire itself became transparent, a known thing, a thing she could see coming before it arrived and choose not to follow. That is not virtue, that is strategy. And Sauron, who was himself primarily a strategist, knew exactly what it meant to face an opponent who had out-strategized him in the domain he considered his own. But there is another dimension here that goes beyond Galadriel's refusal of the ring. The threat she posed to Sauron was not only about what she might have done with the ring if she had taken it. It was about what she was doing without it. Lothlorien, under Galadriel's stewardship, was the only place in Middle-earth where time behaved differently. The Silmarillion and the appendices and unfinished tales all confirm what the text of Fellowship makes plain. Within the borders of the Golden Wood, Sauron's shadow could not penetrate, not because of military strength. Lothlorien had relatively few defenders by the scales of the War of the Ring, but because the Ringcraft threaded through the trees and the earth and the air of that valley created a kind of absolute boundary that Sauron's will could not cross. His eye could not see into it. His influence could not corrupt it. It was, in the full literal sense, beyond his reach. Now hold alongside this. When the ring was destroyed and the power of the three ended, Galadriel herself said that Lothlorien would fade, that the trees would wither, that what she had built would not survive the loss of the ring's age. The beauties of Lothlorien was always ring-augmented. She had always known that. She had always known that the preservation she was working so hard to maintain was contingent, temporary, ultimately doomed if the One Ring was not destroyed. And still she chose that over taking the ring herself. Pay attention to this next part. The White Council, the gathering of the wise, elves, and Istari, who opposed Sauron across the late Third Age, was led in terms of genuine power, not by Saruman, not by Gandalf, but by Galadriel. She had proposed Gandalf as its head and been overruled in favor of Saruman. She had watched Saruman grow evasive and untrustworthy and had drawn her own conclusions about why. She had, by the time the War of the Ring arrived, already built an intelligence network that stretched across much of the Western world, maintained connections with the Dunedain Rangers, understood the movements of Sauron's forces, and was actively deploying Nenya, to protect the last significant elvish realm in Middle-earth. She was not a passive figure waiting in her garden for heroes to pass through. She was running a long war with limited resources, against a force that had been growing in strength for centuries, and she had been holding him at a standstill for 3,000 years, not defeating him. That was never on the table without the ring's destruction, but denying him, preventing him from achieving the kind of decisive victory that would have ended everything. Maintaining the pockets of free civilization that gave the world a chance to survive long enough for the right moment. Sauron was winning, slowly and inevitably, until the War of the Ring. And part of what kept him from winning faster was Galadriel. That is, the threat she posed without the ring. Systematic, patient, strategically sophisticated resistance from someone who understood him clearly, who could not be deceived, who had the power and the will to maintain a defensive posture across millennia. With the ring, she would have matched Sauron. There is one more layer here that almost nobody connects to the Galadriel-Sauron dynamic, and it changes the emotional texture of everything. Galadriel's training in ring perception, her capacity to see clearly, to see through, came in part from the one being in the legendarium whose connection to the nature of power was even more direct than Sauron's. Not Manwë, not Varda, Melian. The history of Galadriel in Celeborn tells us that she spent years in the realm of Doriath, under Melian the Maya, learning from her directly. Melian was the queen of Doriath, wife to Thingol, and one of the most powerful Maiar ever to dwell in Middle-earth. She had surrounded her kingdom with the girdle of Melian, a wall of shadow and enchantment that kept Morgoth himself out, that bent the minds of those who tried to enter without permission. That was in its own way a demonstration of what will operating through sustained craft could accomplish. The girdle was not Ringcraft, but it was the same impulse. A single will expressing itself as a protected boundary, an enclosed world where time and nature obeyed different rules than outside. Galadriel watched this, she studied it. She learned from the most powerful Maya working in Middle-earth as a preserver, a keeper of a space where beauty endured against all pressure from without. And then, when Melian departed Middle-earth after Thingol's death and Doriath fell, Galadriel took that understanding with her and eventually built something similar with different tools. Lothlorien is, in a very real sense, Doriath continued by other means, the enclosed valley, the boundary that the enemy cannot cross, the sense of time preserved against the world's wearing. This is not coincidence, Tolkien left in by accident. What it means for Sauron specifically. Sauron knew Melian. He served under Morgoth during the First Age. He knew the quality of her will, the nature of her power, and when he encountered, in the Second and Third Ages, a Noldorin elf who moved through the world with Melian's particular quality of perception, who could see clearly, who built preservative power rather than aggressive power, who was essentially Melian's student deployed into an age that Melian herself had left. He was dealing with something he had prior experience with, something that had kept Morgoth himself out of Doriath, and something he had never defeated directly. Doriath fell not to Sauron's power or Morgoth's power, but to treachery within. The girdle held until the dragon's treasure dissolved it through internal betrayal. It was never broken from without. Galadriel knew that too. She had watched it, she knew exactly how Melian's model had failed, and she had built her own version with that specific failure mode in mind. Picture this. An ancient golden wood, and at its center a tree city full of silver light, and threading through all of it a power that came from a single source, a single will, a single decision made thousands of years ago and renewed daily. The darkness cannot find a way in because the will holding it out has never relaxed, never slept, never been distracted. 3,000 years, every day, every night. That is not power as we think of power, as force or violence or raw magnitude. That is power as endurance, power as commitment, power as the refusal to stop. That is what Sauron was fighting. And he could not exhaust it from outside. We should name the fear precisely, because it was not a simple thing. Sauron feared many things during the Third Age. He feared the reforging of Narsil and the return of the king, because the Dunedain lineage represented a legitimate authority. He could not simply outmaneuver through deception. He feared the destruction of the One Ring because his soul was bound to it, and its loss meant his loss. He feared Gandalf, in ways the text implies without making explicit. But the nature of the fear was different with Galadriel. With the others, the fear was strategic, a calculation about what they might do, what they were capable of, how they might be countered. With Galadriel, there was something additional, something that does not have a clean strategic name. She was the only being in Middle-earth who was, by Tolkien's own account, capable of replacing him, not opposing him, not defeating him, replacing him. The great and terrible queen, the sorceress, the figure of dreadful power who would have matched Sauron. That was not a coalition of heroes defeating a dark lord. That was a succession, one will replacing another, one order replacing another. And from where the One Ring stood, the mechanism, the instrument, the tool designed to bend all other wills to a single will, it might not have mattered which will that was. Here is what that actually means. Sauron's gamble across the Third Age was always the same. Find the ring, reclaim it, use it to break every remaining resistance. His entire strategy depended on the assumption that he was the only being in Middle-earth whose will was sufficient to wield the One Ring without being consumed by it immediately. He had built his soul into the ring. He understood it from the inside. He was, in a sense, its native speaker. Galadriel was, by Tolkien's assessment, the second native speaker. She was the one being in Middle-earth whose combination of Ringcraft, native power, will, and deliberate self-training had produced something capable of wielding the ring without being immediately destroyed by it, not safely. Tolkien makes clear that no one could have wielded it safely, that it would eventually have conquered any bearer. But long enough to reshape the world in her image before it consumed her. And her image was not Sauron's image, which meant that if she had taken the ring, his gamble was over. Not because he had won, but because someone else had. He was not afraid of being defeated. He was afraid of being replaced by the thing he had built, of the ring fulfilling its purpose with the wrong master. That is a different kind of fear. That is the fear of a craftsman who realizes his most perfect creation could work for someone other than him. So she said, "No, I pass the test. I will diminish, and go into the West and remain Galadriel." Those words deserve more weight than they usually get. Every analysis focuses on the first part, the passing of the test, the refusal of the temptation. But the second part is the one that carries the cost. I will diminish. She is not choosing to remain as she is. She is not choosing preservation. She is choosing to become less. She is choosing to give up Nenya's power, to let Lothlorien fade, to watch the thing she has spent thousands of years building dissolve into ordinary forest as the age of elvish Ringcraft ends. She is choosing to cross the sea to a place that has, for her entire life in Middle-earth, been forbidden, and arriving there as a reduced version of what she was in her prime. Because the power that sustained that prime is gone, and what's left is her, without the augmentation, without the ring, just the ancient Noldorin woman, who came to Middle-earth with ambitions and leaves it with wisdom. The return to Valinor is not a reward, not exactly. It is, in the peculiar logic of Tolkien's moral universe, a completion. She had left under the shadow of a ban that was eventually lifted. By the end, she had earned the pardon the Valar offered. But earning a pardon for something you were never quite guilty of, in the way the ban implied, is a strange comfort. She had not been a kinslayer. She had not sworn the oath of Fëanor. She had left Valinor for her own reasons, which were ambitious and proud but not evil. And yet she had borne the consequences of others' evil, along with her own pride for ages. The crossing of the sea at the end of the Third Age Is Galadriel choosing to finally lay it down, the ambition, the ring, the realm, the role she had built herself into across the long centuries? Diminishing, in the specific sense she uses the word, is not a failure. It is the last and greatest choice of a being who had been making choices between power and wisdom her entire life, and who at the final moment chose wisdom again. But think about what was required to make that choice possible. The ring had to be destroyed first. She could not have made that choice while the ring still existed. The temptation was too real, too present, too specifically calibrated to her deepest desires to be held at arm's length indefinitely. The choice was only possible because two hobbits, a fellowship, and a long, improbable chain of events had ended with Mount Doom. Only after that was the test truly over. She had been running the same test for 3,000 years, and she won barely, and by choosing diminishment rather than triumph, and only because the instrument of her temptation was destroyed before she encountered the moment that would have broken her. Nobody talks about how close it actually was. We are almost at the end, and it is time to return to the question, because by now you know enough that the question hits differently. Did Sauron fear Galadriel because she might have defeated him, or because she was the only being in Middle-earth who could have become him? Here is how the question has changed. At the beginning, it sounded like a choice between two options, defeat or replacement, as if fear of defeat and fear of replacement were distinct. But now, having followed the lore, we can see that Tolkien's architecture makes them the same thing. If Galadriel had taken the ring, she would not have defeated Sauron in any clean sense. She would have become what the ring made of its bearers, a single will imposed on the world, and her will was ordered and beautiful, and she loved people and wanted to preserve everything good and true. And it would still have been domination, because the mechanism of the ring was always Sauron's mechanism, always his grammar, always his vocabulary. And no matter what you said in it, it always meant the same thing in translation. What Sauron feared when he feared Galadriel was not that she would undo him. It was that she would complete him. She would take the instrument he had built to dominate the world and use it to dominate the world with a different face on the tyranny. The ring would be fulfilled. Its purpose would be accomplished. A single will would bend all things to its desire, and Sauron would be gone, replaced by something that looked like his opposite, but operated according to his deepest principle. That is a fear with nowhere to run, because the outcome Sauron feared from Galadriel could not be prevented by defeating her. If she took the ring and he won, he lost anyway. If she took the ring and she won, he lost differently. The only outcome in which the ring-forging strategy succeeded as intended was the one where he himself reclaimed the ring, and the only obstacle to that, the only remaining piece of the board that was aligned against him and could not be outmaneuvered, was a woman in a golden wood who had been saying no to the same temptation for 3,000 years. He needed her to say no, and he needed her to keep saying no, right up until the moment the ring was somewhere he could reach it. She said no, and the ring went somewhere neither of them could reach. Here is what we are really talking about. Not strategy, not power, not ringcraft and cosmological rules and the mechanics of Tolkien's magical system. What we are really talking about is the cost of being the person who stands at the edge of the cliff and does not jump, and what that choice does to you across a life long enough to measure in ages. Galadriel is one of the most powerful beings in Middle-earth. She was born in the light of the two trees. She trained under Melian. She survived the First Age and the Second Age and the Third Age. She wielded a ring of power for 3,000 years. She built something beautiful and enduring in a world that kept trying to unmake everything beautiful and enduring. She recognized Sauron when no one else could. She resisted the temptation that he had specifically designed, across ages of calculation, to be irresistible to beings like her. And at the end of it all, she leaves, not in triumph, not in defeat, in diminishment by her own choice. The realm she built will fade. The trees will remember her and forget her. The power that held the darkness out will lift and the darkness will come back. Eventually, in the way all darkness does, not Sauron's darkness specifically, but the ordinary darkness of time and ruin and entropy that afflicts all mortal things. What she built was always temporary. She always knew that. She built it anyway. That is the thing that should stay with you after this video. Not the power, not the fear she inspired, but the specific quality of her choice, which was not the choice to win or to lose, but the choice to refuse a victory that would have required her to become what she was fighting. She was the only person in Middle-earth who could have ended Sauron by becoming Sauron, and she said no, and she went into the West, and she diminished. There is a kind of wisdom in that which is almost impossible to hold on to, because everything in the shape of human desire and elvish desire, and apparently inner desire, pulls toward the opposite. Toward taking the power that's available, toward using it for good, this time, surely, because you know better than everyone who came before. Toward believing that the difference between you and the tyrant who came before is permanent and structural rather than contingent and fragile. Galadriel knew better. She had looked at herself long enough to know better, and knowing better cost her everything she had built and left her on a ship crossing the sea to a home she had left in youth and would return to as an elder. Middle-earth is full of beings who were undone by power they could not resist. Morgoth reached for the flame of Anor and found that stealing it left him hollowed out. Sauron learned from his teacher's mistake and refined the technique until the refinement itself became the trap. Saruman saw what Sauron was doing and decided to do it better, and became in his smallness a copy of the thing he had tried to surpass. Boromir wanted to save his people and nearly broke the Fellowship to do it. The Nazgul were 9 men who chose long life and power and received exactly what they asked for. And Galadriel sat at the edge of the same cliff as all of them, for thousands of years, with more to offer than any of them, and more reason than any of them to believe she would not make the same mistake. And she chose to step back. Every age has figures like this. Beings defined not by what they did, but by what they refused to become. They are rarely the ones the stories are named for. The stories are named for the hobbits who carried the burden, the kings who returned, the wizards who drove back the darkness. But underneath all of those stories, quietly, there are the ones who created the conditions in which the story could happen at all, who said no when the world would have been changed by their yes, who diminished when diminishment was the only right thing, and who lived with the loss. Now ask yourself the question one more time, not as a strategic calculation, as something true about the nature of power in Tolkien's world, and maybe about the nature of power in any world. Did Sauron fear Galadriel because she might have defeated him, or because she was the only being in Middle-earth who could have become him? And then ask yourself the harder question underneath it. Why, in the end, is that the most frightening kind of power? Not the power to defeat, but the power to become. What does it mean that the figure who most threatened Sauron was not the one who could have destroyed him, but the one who could have replaced him indistinguishably with a version of him that loved beauty? I think the answer is somewhere in what Galadriel said in the garden when she described what she would have been. Dark and terrible. Not evil, necessarily, but dark, but terrible. Because power of that magnitude cannot help being those things, even when it is used for love. If you've sat with that question and it has not resolved, good. It is not supposed to resolve. Tolkien built questions like this into the architecture of his world because he believed the questions were more important than answers, and that a story which ended with everything explained had failed at the most important thing stories do. Stay with the unresolved question. That is where the lore lives.